Here's an example. An example is to consider what happens when we place a tax in a market. And we're going to look at this in greater detail in a little while here. But if we consider a market that's in equilibrium at Q1, and buyers are paying price P1 and sellers are accepting price P1 in our initial equilibrium, if we consider what happens when we place a tax on this market, what happens is that sellers raise their reservation price because they are now faced with the tax. And we wind up with a new equilibrium price up here for buyers. Sellers only get to keep this much down here. And a new equilibrium quantity. The quantity of goods falls in this market. Right? Now, consider the change in surplus, the change in economic welfare that comes about when we impose a tax in this market. The first thing to note is, where was consumer surplus and producer surplus originally, before we placed the tax? Consumer surplus at the beginning includes everything above the price up to the demand curve. So this is triangle A, B, and C. Triangles A, B, and C represent consumer surplus in the initial equilibrium. Producer surplus is everything below the price and down to the supply curve, down to the marginal opportunity cost. So this is areas D, E, and F. What happens after the tax? After the tax, we get a fall in output, a reduction in consumer surplus. Buyers now face a higher effective price when they have to add on the tax. So consumer surplus falls from A, B, C down to just A, the price buyers effectively have to pay, and up to the demand curve. Consumer surplus, well, the sellers now receive some smaller price in the face of the tax. So the price that sellers effectively have to pay down to the supply curve represents the new level of producer surplus, or area F. Now, all of this is not lost, though. Some of this is now in the hands of the government. Rectangle B and rectangle D are tax revenues, and presuming that the government spends the money wisely, these are things that are not lost to society. They're just things that transfer from consumer and producer surplus into government revenues, which will be used to produce other things. What is lost, however, are these transactions that no longer happen that used to create a net benefit. Right? Area C and area E are lost. This is an efficiency loss that comes about because of the tax. Here's a unit that would provide a benefit to the consumer who might buy it, could be produced at a cost that's lower than it would take, that's lower than, in fact, the old equilibrium price, but that transaction never happens because of the tax. So in this case, just to summarize, after the tax, consumer surplus falls from A plus B plus C to A. Producer surplus falls from D plus E plus F to F. B plus D are recaptured as tax revenue. And then C plus E is lost. It's a welfare loss. This is an efficiency loss. So when we intervene in this market, we create a loss in economic efficiency known as deadweight loss. Note the following. Price controls, taxes, quotas, subsidies, regulations, trade restrictions, collusive activities, all of these things inhibit the ability of markets to get out to that equilibrium, out to that level that maximizes efficiency. And whenever we do this, we introduce welfare losses. So why do we do these things? Why might we want to intervene in markets? And there are certainly reasons why we might consider doing this. The first one is that not all markets work as well and as cleanly as the textbook example we described here. In some markets, we face problems with things like externalities. If a market creates pollution, for instance, these are things that aren't reflected in the market price. Public goods are things that markets have a hard time producing. Markets have a hard time producing, for instance, roads on their own, or parks, or green space, and there are a lot of things, a lot of public goods, fire services, police services, things like that. There are a lot of goods that are very difficult for markets to provide, but that a government might be able to. So in this sense, we might say that the tax revenue the government creates from imposing a tax in the market we just described can be better spent by government than it could be spent by the public. So in that case, we may create inefficiency, increased efficiency by taking some money through taxes and spending them in the production of goods that the market has a difficult time producing it, or by using those taxes to reduce the production of externalities to solve a different kind of market failure. The other reason, and this is often important, is that sometimes we might not be concerned with efficiency, we might be concerned with equity. And so our goal is not to to maximize the size of the economic pie, the grand total net benefit, but it might be to make sure that everybody gets an equal slice, make sure everybody gets an even-sized slice of the pie. That redistribution may be our goal.